Hello and welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Chris Shaw. I'm a registered dietitian and a personal trainer. Today I'm going to be talking to you about 6 movement patterns to include in every fitness program. Now, the patterns that we're going to discuss today can be used no matter what your goals are. And if you start to use these and really find balance in that program, you can be sure that no matter what it is that you're doing, you will move towards your goals in a way that's sustainable and will help you prevent some injuries that often occur in training when there is an imbalance in that training methodology. So very often when people start training, they start working toward a goal, they'll come up with a list of exercises to follow. Now, exercises will fit these patterns, but when we're just choosing exercises and not looking at the overall picture, it can be easy for that misalignment to occur in the training program. So by instead of focusing on specific exercises and pulling back and looking instead at these 6 movement patterns that we're going to go over, you can pick and choose exercises within them without having to stress so much about what that specific exercise is, as long as you were incorporating that overall global movement pattern into your program each and every week as we continue to move forward. And using this method here, you will be able to structure your workouts, and we'll go over this in the end, but you'll be able to structure your workouts as your goals fluctuate. Maybe you have a strength-based goal now, you want to move into hypertrophy, maybe you want to increase muscle tone, maybe you want to improve athletic performance. It really doesn't matter what the goal is. Using this pattern first methodology, you will be able to adjust this and create a program that's perfect for all of your goals. So the first movement pattern that we are going to look at is the squat and the lunge movement pattern. So now these fall into the same categories because even though they are different exercises that you can plug into those 2 different categories, they fall into the one umbrella because it's utilizing the same movement of the joints and the hip and the knee and the ankle, and it's using a lot of the same musculature in that movement pattern. So to start programming this, right, we're going to look at any exercises that include any squat variation, any lunge variation, and we'll adjust this in a little bit, but any movement pattern that you're choosing, you always want to be sure to use them in different ranges of motion. So for example, if you're doing a lunge, right, you might do a forward lunge. We also want to program reverse lunges or lunges out to the side, like a side lunge or maybe a clock lunge. Anything that's getting you moving in different planes will help ensure that one, your program is balanced and you were training in every different movement pattern and different movement plane. And it's also going to prepare you for real life. When things come up, maybe you trip off of a curb, very rarely are we static in life. So when you are training these, whether it's athletic performance or just injury prevention in the real world, when we can train all of these different movement patterns that we're going to go over in different ranges and different planes of motion, you're going to be sure that no matter what is going on in your life, you'll be prepared for all of that. So again, the first one is squat and lunge. Any squat or lunge variation would fit into that category. So the next movement pattern that we are going to be looking at is the hip hinge. So the hip hinge, as the name implies, is any movement pattern, any exercise selection that fits within this movement pattern that is causing you to hinge at the hip. So this would incorporate any exercises like deadlifts, maybe you have straight leg deadlifts, Romanian deadlifts, glute bridges, kettlebell swings, anything that's using predominantly the hip joint as the mover in that exercise will fit into this category. So as you can see, again, same as the other one, if we can get some different ranges of motion, different planes of motion into this as we're incorporating these different things, maybe single leg exercises, bilateral exercises, anything that's going to switch it up and allow that program to be really well-rounded is important. And so as you can see, just looking at the lower body portion of things, we have a squat and a lunge, and then we have the hip hinge. So when you're thinking about programming moving forward, we really want to make sure that we have an equal amount, we have a balance between these 2 movement patterns, because although they aren't necessarily opposing movement patterns, if we can have both of them in equal amounts, we're going to be sure that any of that lower body training, which is not only important for athletic performance, but just exercise selection in general is really important here for overall health and injury prevention in life. So we can have some balance there. We can make sure that those 2 things are incorporated in every program. You can be sure that you're off to a really good start. The next movement pattern that we're going to be looking at is the push movement pattern. So, as you can probably guess, the pushing movement pattern is anything that is pushing something away from your body. This falls a lot into the exercise selection of chest exercises, right? So we have bench press, maybe you have overhead press, you have ring dips, regular dips, whatever it is. If you can start to think about this exercise selection in this movement pattern as something that we can start working in different planes, again, it just creates so much more balance, creates injury prevention, and it really creates a really well-rounded program that's gonna help you get to your results a little bit quicker, and you're gonna feel a lot better doing it. So this can be anything from bench press, dumbbell press, overhead press, anything that's working dips, anything that's working the vertical and the horizontal plane is really important. And when we're choosing these exercises, you really want to make sure that you have an equal amount of horizontal pushing exercises to vertical pushing exercises. If we can have an equal selection of those two things, you're going to make sure that you're working that musculature in a very even and consistent way, which is really important for preventing injuries overall, but especially shoulder injuries when it comes to pushing movements. And with that said, talking about that balance for upper body and creating something that is shoulder friendly, one thing that often gets overlooked and is so important in any program is the pulling movement pattern. So when we're looking at pulling movement patterns, again, it's anything that's pulling something closer to your body, right? Predominantly back-based exercises. So same thing as the pushing. We want to make sure that we're working in the horizontal plane. We want to make sure that we're working in the vertical plane. So that would be like a lat pull down or a pull up would be in that vertical plane. The horizontal plane would be a row. Any row variation in this range of motion here. When we're doing this, if everything is fine, if you have no injuries that you're working through, if you feel like you have a pretty well balanced program, a 1-to-1 is fine, equal amounts of pushing to pulling exercises. For a lot of people, especially someone who is working at a desk all day, if you feel like you sit at a computer a lot of the time, maybe you have some rounded shoulders, it can be, in some cases, beneficial to have 2 pulling exercises for every 1 pushing exercise. The way we live today, it really reinforces a lot of the pushing movement pattern. So we get very tight in the front and a little bit weaker in the back. So we can work on strengthening that musculature that pulls everything back. You can create a better program that's going to help prevent injuries and help you feel better a little bit quicker. But again, all of this that I'm going over here, this isn't necessarily cookie cutter advice. This is just something to keep in mind. You really need to be mindful of how you feel, how you move. I would talk to a professional about any movement pattern assessments that you can go to, especially if you have a history of injury before implementing any of this. But again, just to keep in mind as you're moving forward, if we can create balance through all of these, you're going to create a program that's going to really help you reach your goals in a way that is safe and sustainable. So moving forward into this next portion here, we have core, right? It's everybody's favorite. So we have core stabilization and rotation. So the core musculature is a wide range. Normally when people think of core, they think six-pack muscles, right? It is so much more than that. And the main function of the core musculature is to stabilize, is to prevent the spine from moving when you are moving. Your spine wants to stay nice and stable as you're moving horizontally, vertically, jumping, whatever it is. It wants to be protected, and to protect your spine, we need a strong core. So oftentimes core rotation exercises are overemphasized. Core stabilization exercises are underemphasized. Core rotation exercises really is anything that is looking at flexion, extension, or rotation of that spine. So exercises that fall into this category are the traditional crunches, reverse crunches, maybe you have wood chops when you're up high and then you come down low here. Anything that's rotating or flexing and extending the spine would fall into that category. Really important to have those, but we really want to make sure that the balance between the core rotation and stabilization is right there. And as I mentioned before with the pulling, maybe you want a 2-to-1 pulling to pushing. In the beginning, it might be beneficial to have 2 core stabilization exercises for every 1 core rotation, just because this usually is an area of weakness for a lot of people. So core stabilization exercises that you can start thinking about incorporating would be things such as the plank, side plank, anything that's anti-rotation like a pull-off press, where the weight is out to the side and you're pressing it away, preventing any rotation. Your body's gonna wanna rotate, you're keeping it nice and stable through movement. Those are things that you can start incorporating into that program to help strengthen that core stabilization, which will lend a ton of benefit to the rest of these movement patterns and just to your daily life as well. So coming up on this last movement pattern here, it is my personal favorite, and it is the carry. Any carries, maybe you're familiar with farmers walks, anything that you're holding weight and moving through space counts as a carry. We evolved carrying things. It's a very important part of our physiology, and it's something we don't do as often anymore. So if you can, in that program at some point, whether it's every single time you work out, maybe you just have a day where you do a few carrying exercises to close it out as additional conditioning, as additional strength work. If you can start getting some carries in, I promise you're gonna notice a really big change in your progress. So with carries, it can be carrying 2 dumbbells and just walking a distance down and back really simply. There are other things when you're carrying that you can start to bleed into some of these other movement patterns, such as core stabilization. A way to do that would be to grab 1 dumbbell and have it in one hand as you're walking, because what's going to happen is if you have a heavy enough weight in that one hand, your body's going to want to bend. So in walking and preventing your body from bending and staying up tall, you're actually working a lot of that core stabilization musculature as you're carrying, so it's a little bit of a 2-to-1 there. So the carry is often overlooked. It's not a very common exercise, but if you can start incorporating that movement pattern, I promise it's going to pay off. So as we're looking at everything here to close this out, when you are thinking about building a plan based off of all of this, we want to make sure that we have balance. And that balance is going to look different for everyone. So in looking at this, when we're looking at this from a program design standpoint, the first thing that I always recommend people do after getting a movement assessment, after really figuring out what their goals are, what they're looking for, figuring out if there are any limitations or injuries, again, I would definitely ask someone for some help on this, especially if you notice any nagging injuries that you're not really sure of. Get all of that cleared up before using and jumping into any exercise program. But if you're good to go, if you're cleared, if you've spoken to people and you feel good about it and you want to start designing a program using this, first thing I always like to recommend is figure out how many days a week you have realistically to exercise. So anytime we're looking at maybe like 2 up to 3 days a week, I always recommend full body exercise programs here, because we're able to get a lot more work in that shorter period of time, and it just really helps moving forward. So if you are interested in a full body exercise program, something that you can do is pick exercises from 1 through 6, do those 6 exercises in that workout. You know you're gonna be balanced, you know you're gonna be hitting every single movement pattern, and it takes a lot of the guesswork out of that. Again, being sure that when you're picking pushing, you're doing horizontal and vertical equally, pulling, you're doing horizontal and vertical equally, and you're doing equal amounts of core stabilization and rotation. If you have more time to devote to the gym, if you're just interested in not doing full body, but you want to do some body part splits, something else that you can do is a push-pull split. So if we're doing a pushing day, I always like to use the squat and lunge here for pushing, as well as the push specific. So that would be day 1. Day 2 would be the hip hinge movements with the pulling, like the rowing, the pull downs, things like that would be incorporated into it. And then you can either have a 3rd day on its own for core work and carrying work, or you can split up the core work and carrying work and put them into the pushing and the pulling days consecutively, and then work out 4 days a week maybe if you're doing that program, where you have a push day, pull day, day off, push day, pull day. Something like that works out pretty well. Another option for you would be a lower body and an upper body split. So if you're doing lower body, upper body, you would do squat, lunge, and hip hinge movement patterns for lower body. The upper body would incorporate the pushing and the pulling. And again, core stabilization, rotation, and carrying, you can put into the program depending on what your preference is. Just make sure that all 6 of these are being worked on equally. Lastly, if you have a lot of time to be in the gym and you really like to focus on specific things, you could do 5 days a week where you have a squat day, hinge day, push day, pull day, core stabilization day, and use the carries spread out in there and finish up the workouts with some carries. So as you can see, there's a ton of variability. There are a ton of different ways that you can use this, but if you could just start thinking about movement patterns over exercises, you can be sure that the program that you are creating is well-rounded, it's going to suit you better in the short term and the long term, and it's a lot easier to make adjustments on the fly when needed. So if you have any questions about this, please drop a comment below. As always, if you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot, and you'll get some notifications when new videos come up. Please reach out if you have any questions at all. I will talk to you soon.